Good morning, everyone. Hi, welcome to Tel Aviv University. My name is Maria Lol, and I'm an Irwin Cotler Fellow for the 2025-2026 cohort. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second event of the Diplomats Club for this academic year. Diplomats Club is an initiative of the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Justice, and Human Rights here at Tel Aviv University. It's named after the renowned Canadian human rights advocate and former Minister of Justice, Irwin Cotler, and is dedicated to advancing democracy, human rights, and justice through research, education, and public engagement. Now, before we begin our program, I would like to extend a special welcome to distinguished representatives of the diplomatic community, those already with us and those who will be joining us shortly. We are honored to have with us today Her Excellency Ambassador Maya Solomou from Greece, His Excellency Ambassador Gint Serafinox from Latvia, His Excellency Ambassador Alexander Reutemann from Moldova, Her Excellency Ambassador Eileen Mendiola from the Philippines, and His Excellency Ambassador Nimal Bandara from Sri Lanka. We also would like to welcome the diplomatic representatives from the embassies and delegations of Azerbaijan, Brazil, Chile, China, Cote d'Ivoire, Cyprus, Egypt, Estonia, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Nigeria, Romania, Slovenia, Spain, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Zambia. And Kenya. Now to the topic at hand, the United States and the age of disorder. Our first session looks at the future of American democracy at a moment of deep polarization, institutional strain, and global uncertainty. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker, Professor Uriah Shavit, who is the head of the Irwin Cotler Institute. Professor Shavit.
Is Yoav already here, or do I have more time? Okay. Great. So first, thank you, Maria, for doing such a great job in organizing this event and moderating it. Really a beautiful job you're doing. So there's been a lot of debate in recent months, even recent years, as to the future of American democracy and whether it is in danger. And I can only contribute the following. I find this debate a bit awkward for the following reason. I'm not familiar with a single theory in political science according to which, at the present time, the United States is a democracy. So people asking, what does the future hold for the United States, for the American democracy? I fear are asking the wrong question simply because in our lives, the way our brain works, it's very difficult for us to get used to things when they change in a transformative way. Then we try to adjust reality to accommodate it to what we are used to. Here is why I'm saying this. There are two kinds of theories in the study of democracy. First type of theories are the idealist normative theories. That is, what we think democracy should be. What makes a system of government, what makes a society democratic in the ideal sense. And then obviously, and this is not a phenomenon of recent years, obviously the United States has many, many problems. And by the way, most democracies, perhaps even all democracies, are not ideal democracies. When you have an ideal, it's very hard to meet the ideal. So obviously, where you have a system where money and big money is so fundamental to the outcome of elections, obviously that's not ideal. When you have a system where so many people don't get a chance to vote for all sorts of reasons, or are simply indifferent to voting, that's obviously not ideal. But these are idealist normative theories, and my concern is not about them. We have another approach, which is the empirical approach. which doesn't ask so much what we would like democracy to be, but more or less what is the minimal criteria for a society, for a system of government to be considered democratic. And the minimal criteria is one. I guess you know what that is. The minimal criteria is not whether women are allowed to vote. Maybe it should be, but that's not considered the minimal criteria. Whether the age of voting is 18 or 21, that's not the minimal criteria. The minimal criteria is one. Is it possible to change the government without using force, without using violence? That's the basic criteria. There is not a single scholar of democracy would argue that a society where you cannot change government without using force is eligible to be considered a credible democracy. Now, here is what happened in the United States, which people kind of tend to pretend never happened. What happened 5 years ago was that there was a violent attack on Congress, inspired and encouraged by the sitting president, the incumbent, with the aim of stopping a peaceful transfer of power, with the declared aim, the declared goal. And people died, several people died, although I think only one directly. Dozens of people were severely injured. And there was no hiding of the fact that the objective of that attack was to stop the peaceful transfer of power. Now, that in and of itself is not a total rarity in the history of democracies. We saw something not similar, but we saw an attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power in South Korea a year ago. We saw it in Brazil in 2022. We saw something, again, not similar, but in spirit similar in Spain on February 23rd, 1981. It's not something that never happens in democracies. But here's the difference. Days after that failed attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power in the United States, it seemed that the Trumpist cause is lost, because even the likes of Lindsey Graham refound their spines and spoke very bluntly against what happened. But only a month passed, and they all went to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring, because they discovered, to their horror, the following thing. They discovered that the vast majority of the voters of their party, their political party, are not averse, to say the least, to what happened on January 6th. That they believe the elections were a fraud, that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president, and consequently, they believe that what happened on the Capitol was a legitimate attempt to stop injustice. Now, this wasn't a majority of the American people, but this was a substantial portion of the American people. And you can argue, okay, so what happened? Hundreds of people were sent to prison. Joe Biden was president. And then you had, 4 years later, you had legitimate elections and so forth. But the truth is, which again, the insipid so-called professional American media is very eager to conceal or to deceive itself that that is not the truth. The truth is that there was every indication that the exact same thing, and worse, would happen if Kamala Harris had won. And Americans went out to vote knowing that. And the moment they did, you can no longer argue that the United States is a country where there is a peaceful transfer of power assured. That thing broke. That thing is no longer so. That's the sad reality, and we have to engage with reality for what it is, not for what we would like it to be. For decades, the United States was the leader of democracy in the world. At the present time, it cannot credibly argue for this to be the case. Now, what will happen in 3 years, I don't know. And I would beg everyone not to underestimate the ability of the United States to revive, to reform. It has shown that in the past. But there are some indicators that this is not going to go well. And I'll mention just a few. I think there is a general consensus that the American electoral system is broken and needs to be amended, needs to be reformed. And the things that need to be reformed concern both the interests of the Democratic Party, the Democrats, and those of the Republicans. This is not a partisan issue. There is almost zero chance for that to happen because to change election laws, you do need bipartisan consensus. To change the Constitution, you need a very broad agreement. And it's unlikely that this will happen because each and every one of the flaws that currently prevail in the American electoral system benefit one of the two parties, at least potentially. So that party has no interest in seeing a change. That's one problem. The other problem is, and this is something some of us discussed already, I don't think the United States today is more polarized on the big issues than it was, say, in the 60s. I don't think it is. But what it has today, which it did not have in the 60s, are instruments of power, mainly media, that thrive on escalating polarization. The way media worked in the 60s was that you had to search for common ground. Simply the technical structure of media was that you have to search for middle ground. You had to search for common ground to sell your product. That is no longer the case for reasons that you all know, which means there is very little likelihood that the binaries, the divisions within American society, will be somehow reconciled or at least moderated. So we are facing a situation whereby we have a broken system whose democratic nature is no longer assured, and we have no reason for optimism that it will manage to correct itself. We have to add to that, and maybe the Americans in the audience will be able to later correct me or add to what I'm saying. We have to add to that a certain sense of national depression, of national lack of resourcefulness. Here's the thing. I think until recently, if you were an American in your 20s, you had every reason to assume that your quality of life will end up being better than those of your parents. That was better than those of your grandparents. I don't think that's the case today. I don't think that's the case today. And I don't think that's going to change in the near future because, you can argue about one or another policy, but what the United States needs most and is not delivered to Americans at the moment is a huge investment in infrastructure and huge investment in narrowing educational gaps, educational disparities, which can never happen without some narrowing of wealth disparities. Is there a reason why the United States spends more money on health, for example, than Israel? Almost double more. And yet life expectancy here, but also in Chile, in Costa Rica, in Taiwan, in Kuwait, I could go on, is so much higher. Because before we talk about quality of life, there is life. But what makes this worse is that, when you as a society face difficulties, you can always treat them as a challenge, as let's take this crisis and make our lives better. But you can only do that if you acknowledge the crisis. And one of the things we see in the United States is a total incapacity of appreciating those things that do not work and being inspired and learning from countries where they do work. Because there is a reason why Israelis live so much longer than Americans. It has to do with a healthcare system that is based on socialist mechanisms. But as long as you treat the word socialism as a bad word, the F word, by the way, is no longer a bad word, but the S word is still a bad word, the word that should not be said, you cannot really address it. And here's the thing. If you pay less for something and you get a better product, what do I care if you call it socialism, capitalism, whatever? And yet there is lack of substantive debate in American society about this. And there is still this obsession with identity politics, especially on the side of the Democrats. But the problem is universal. I don't know if any of you saw or read what Kamala Harris said when she explained how she made her pick for VP, for the vice presidential nominee. She said, I knew the best person to do the job is Pete Buttigieg, but I thought Americans are not ready to have a black president with a gay vice president. That would be too much. Now, here's a woman whose main credentials in becoming a vice presidential nominee was identity politics, and she disqualifies someone because of his identity, without seeing the irony of all of this. And then I read a review in the Washington Post about Marty Supreme. The Washington Post, yes, liberal, semi-liberal newspaper, more or less says, this movie explains why everyone wants to be like us. Who wants to be like you? I mean, when you have that mindset, this arrogance, how will you initiate a process of correction, a process of reform? This is a serious, serious problem. In almost a Spenglerian way, I tried this morning to think, when was the last time I watched an American film, read an American book, a new American television series that I felt was truly inspiring, truly original, truly groundbreaking? When was that? I say Spenglerian because this is the sense of a civilization that has come to a dead end, that needs to find new ways to reinvent itself. A word about geopolitics. Look, there was an inherent problem with Trump's idea of international diplomacy. And here it is. You tend to think of Trump and Obama as the two most different people on planet Earth, two most different presidents that could have ever been. The truth is, they have a lot in common, more than I think both would like to think. One thing they had in common was that both became presidents without almost any relevant experience. And they became presidents because of their lack of relevant experience. The other reason, or the other similarity, is that both were very, very quickly iconized, although they really didn't do anything in their lives that sanctioned their being iconized. And then finally, they both were almost the only people in the American public sphere who were against the war in Iraq before it became popular to be against the war in Iraq. And people remember that because that war has become very unpopular. And it has become very unpopular because it turned the United States into a country on the brink of bankruptcy. So there are two consequences to the war in Iraq. One, that Americans don't have appetite for wars. And the second, that they anyhow cannot afford to start new wars. There's just not the money and not the human resources. Obama tried to mask this reality with a lot of gentle talk, a lot of embracing talk, if you remember the Cairo speech. But the truth was the same. The United States simply cannot afford to enter into new wars. Trump tried a different strategy, which I think is more appeasing for the proud mind, which is somewhat in contradiction to the old school rules of diplomacy. Talk very loud while carrying a very small stick. Of course, you're supposed to do the exact opposite. Talk softly while carrying a very big, strong stick. The problem is when you talk very loud and people know that your stick is somewhat negligible, your ability to impose, your ability to encourage your wishes, your desires, is very limited. Which is why this cannot really lead to any constructive result. Now, look at the case of Greenland, which somehow people still take in a way that's almost like entertainment. Let's see what the crazy guy will do now. It's not. It's not. This is really the end of everything. Because this is something I sometimes try to explain to diplomats about Israel. When people sort of entertain as if this is like a funny thing, as if this is like a legitimate issue to entertain, whether Israel has a right to exist. Put aside all the moral issues, put aside historical justice, all this. Once you break the international system once a state recognized by the United Nations once is being challenged or doubted, everything is. There is a total reshuffle. So the question is not Greenland as such. The question is, if you can talk in 1930s terms about the annexation of a territory that does not belong to you because you need, there's no need for the translation here. You are breaking the entire system and then it would become, the entire international system, and then it would become irreparable. And what I think Americans don't understand is that the day is coming very close to their having it as their problem as individuals. This will not, if something like this happens, this will not remain a bilateral issue, something that goes over the heads of individuals. Americans themselves will pay the price. They will not be welcomed as tourists. Whatever they have to sell in the world would not find buyers. There's not going to be a World Cup. That is the reality. That is not said clearly enough. People are still treating all of this as some kind of game. It's not. It's not. This brings me to the final point, which is Israel. Now, we have a problem here. We have a problem here. Trump is a very unpopular president. Israelis are not always looking at the numbers. He's a very unpopular president. Not in historically lows, but very unpopular. Almost since his first days in his second term. But he is very popular in this country. And that creates a potential problem. That there is so much affinity between a president who is so much disliked across the world and in his own country, and one small country so dependent on the United States, where he is very popular. And the day of reckoning is inevitable. I think it's very crucial that when it comes, the world would be reminded that there were Israelis who were not a happy party to this, on whom this was enforced. Why? Because I share with you the following situation. Hanukkah ceremony in the White House. And there you have Donald Trump. And there you have the biggest Jewish philanthropist of our times. And a woman of many achievements, Miriam Ederson. And when I say of many achievements, I mean that. It's not an empty compliment. And she says, a very distinct Israeli-American accent, she says, I spoke outside there with Ellen Dershowitz about this legal thing of a third term. And then Trump responds that Sheldon Adelson cared so passionately about Israel. That was what he cared about. So what do we have here? You don't need to be Tucker Carlson to be unhappy with seeing this scene. What do you have here? You have a very rich Jew treating the American Constitution and the future of the Union as if this is some kind of toy for the rich and famous to play with. You have this on the one hand, and then you have an American president explaining that that very rich Jewish philanthropist only cared about Israel. You're playing with fire here. Is it logical to argue that the following statement now, there are rich Jews influencing the American president so that Israel would benefit, is it now logical to refer to that as anti-Semitism? And the very final word, I think much of the international community never really understood what was at stake post-October 7. Because you had from day one a massive campaign led by several countries in Europe, led by all the enemies of or the rivals of the United States outside Europe, and of course by the Arab world, that basically called for the war to end with an immediate ceasefire, the implication of which would have been a total victory for Hamas and a total defeat for Israel. I'm talking about the immediate aftermath of the war, that is the first weeks after the war ended, after the war started. So it was vital, in my opinion, that Israel did not fall into this trap, that it insisted on continuing the fight, and that within a year we saw the Hamas leadership killed, which I think was vital for the most basic human instinct and demand for justice. Within a year, we saw the Hamas leadership killed, all of it killed, and we saw the vast majority of the Gaza Strip taken over by the IDF. None of this would have been possible had it not been for the commitment of the United States to Israel's defense and existence. But Israelis tend to forget one thing, and those who tend to forget it perhaps do so because they forgot one of the most important values of Judaism, which is hakarat hatov, recognition of gratitude. All of that happened with Joe Biden as president, not with Donald Trump as president. So with the many issues that there are with his presidency and many questions that need to be raised, including whether he was competent through much of it, the fact remains it was Joe Biden that led Israel or enabled Israeli victory. And that this is not recognized in Israel today is, aside of just being an incredible display of lack of gratitude, is also something that could cost very heavily and not in the very far future. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the day. And Maria, thank you again for the organization.
Thank you, Professor Shavit. You started off with some very interesting points this morning. So now we're going to be moving on to our next speaker, Professor Yoav Frommer, who is from Tel Aviv University. You have 30 minutes. I have stuff for it.
So just give me a warning or something. 2 minutes before I need to end. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Thank you for the fascinating remarks. I will maybe I'll respond a bit during the short talk to this, but it certainly connects to the opening remarks, because this is right kind of U.S.-Israel relations are obviously something that are very vital to our life here in Israel, and it's something that I'll start with an anecdote, right? That I remember I was in China, I was in Beijing giving a few talks in right before COVID, so it was 2018, and the question that I faced everywhere I went was, and it wasn't in any way anti-Semitic or anything like that. It was a genuine question, and the question was, how do you get the Americans to do whatever you want? That was like a serious expectation. And again, there was nothing kind of nefarious about it. It was like, tell us what's the secret, right? To lobby. So obviously there's no secret, but it is a vexing question. And it's a question, right, that when we just look at the numbers, of course, cumulatively, really since 1948, Israel has received well over $300 billion, right? By far more than all the other countries, especially if we're talking about FMF, foreign military financing. As of now, Israel receives $3.8 billion a year, right? Dollars, of course, that's the last MOU. That's kind of these agreements that started in the 1990s, fixed agreements for a decade. Clinton and then Bush, the second Bush, and of course Obama. This is Obama's legacy, Obama's gift, right? You mentioned the idea of sometimes we exercise ingratitude in Israel. Unfortunately, I agree with that, and certainly towards Obama, who gave us way more money than I think Trump's ever going to give us, right? And this is ending in 2028. So now this government in Israel needs to begin renegotiating this. And we've already heard Netanyahu give last week, I think it was with The Economist, he gave an interview. He was already suggesting that maybe we're not, we need to transition out of this. And as an Israeli, it's about time we need to end this, because you mentioned Tucker Carlson. I'll talk a bit about him. Americans are looking at this, are looking at the fact that Israel is one of the leading, fastest growing economies in the world, one of the wealthiest nations, right? OECD country, rapidly growing with its tech sector and so forth, and it's still receiving $3.8 billion in American taxpayer money. How do we begin to explain that, right? So what I'll do in this very brief I'm a historian, by the way, so that's my perspective, right? I'll just give a brief historical kind of survey of how we got to this, because it wasn't always the case. And we need to understand that the U.S.-Israel relations, there's nothing deterministic about it. It's very contingent, and it possibly, if different factors in the Arab world, a couple of decisions by Nasser in the 1950s, a few different decisions by the Soviets in the 1960s, there would have been no special relationship, right? So we need to think historically about these contingencies. And I say that because now, looking forward to the future of U.S.-Israel relations, there's nothing that guarantees that it will continue to be the way it was. And this is something that I think a lot of Israeli policymakers, including this government, including this prime minister, do not understand. I grew up in New York. in the 80s with Netanyahu. I went to the same school as his older daughter. They don't really talk about her a lot. And as a historian, I look at Netanyahu's thinking about the United States, and I keep thinking to the 1980s New York, because that's how Netanyahu still understands America, with evangelicals and rich kind of, conservative Jews, like, you mentioned Edelson, but, the New York crowd, and he doesn't understand it. It's a totally different country. It's a different Jewish community. It's a different America. It's a different Republican Party. And that's just something I'll come back to maybe at the end. So just, right, so I start with this peace for security because we tend to forget one of the reasons Israel begins getting sophisticated American weaponry. Eventually, it begins with low interest rates as loans, and eventually as grants from the 1980s, and eventually this $3.8 billion a year is not out of the goodness of the heart of the American Congress, right? It's because of strategic needs that the United States had. The understanding was, and this goes back to Kennedy, right? Here's Kennedy, who's really the first to sell Israel advanced weaponry, the Hawk missiles in 1962. It's this understanding that if Israel's more secure, it will have some kind of inclination to also enter into these negotiations that would result in land for peace. After 67, this of course becomes much more urgent for the Americans. And that was the understanding, right? Kennedy also thought it would dissuade Israel from pursuing a nuclear program. Right, that of course was not the case, but that was the rationale, strategic rationale from a lot of American policymakers who began this kind of very generous relationship to Israel. So this is just in general. We need to think of Israel in a wider context, of course, of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Power, national security, that is, right, you don't need me to tell you, that is the primary driving force for American foreign policy. It always has been. Nevertheless, right, I mean, there's power, there's petroleum, of course, oil, the prices of oil, the production of oil. It's not that the U.S. really needs Saudi oil, right? Even in the 1970s, when it imported relatively a lot, it was never dependent really on that. The import here is that much of this oil was going to American allies, NATO allies, European allies in the 50s and 60s, right? At the height of the Cold War, this was very important. And it also, it prevents oil prices from fluctuating, from going too high, too low, which is also something very important for American business, for the American economy, American corporations, but also American politics. The third factor is domestic politics. You mentioned Edelson. There is an Israel lobby. It's not a secret. It's very successful. There are many other lobbies in America. It's just the pro-Israel lobby is very good at what they do, and that sometimes pisses off a lot of its rivals, and also lends itself to a lot of conspiratorial and anti-Semitic kind of innuendo. And finally, Israel, right? I say Palestine because this precedes the creation of Israel. But what happens here in this land, right? This is before 1948, right? It was British Palestine, then Ottoman Palestine. It was always very important for Americans, right? And Israel today is, again, I don't know if it's going to remain that way, but it is one of the pillars of how Americans look at the Middle East. It's not the only one, it's not the most important one, but it's there. All right, so this is just kind of an overview of how Americans think about the Middle East. If we look more narrowly, we zoom into the seeds of the special relationship, and this is what I'll just elaborate on for the next few minutes. We usually divide it into 3 or 4 different aspects. Does anyone, by the way, know this? I used to have a T-shirt. This is actually a T-shirt. I have America, don't worry. Israel is behind you. This is you can still buy them if you like in Jerusalem in the old city market. But this was it's a joke, of course, right? But this is it says something about Israeli arrogance, right? This was very popular in the 1980s. I had a T-shirt like that. That kind of how Israelis think of themselves. But the point here, I think, that if we think about the origins of the relationship, the first pillar is strategic, right? And it's the fact that Israel was able to prove itself over time as a reliable partner, right? First as a strategic partner in the Cold War to help contain the Soviets' encroachment into the Arab world, as a stabilizing force, right? That could stabilize the region and prevent unstable characters like Saddam Hussein, like Assad at certain moments, like Nasser at certain moments, from destabilizing, right, the region. A very good arms client. I think I was looking at DoD statistics a few days ago, and I believe Israel's the 3rd largest purchaser over time of American weapons, right? Then that's a lot of money. It's obviously in the tens of the billions of dollars. And more recently, really in the last 20, 30 years, intelligence and technology sharing, right? The anti-missile defense systems like Arrow, as you know, and Iron Dome, and those, of course, as the most famous, you know this. So that's the first pillar, right? National security. The second is domestic politics. We mentioned this Israel lobby, the Jewish vote, so forth. I'm going to elaborate on all these. I'm just setting it out here briefly. When we talk about shared values, and we need to really qualify that because these values, of course, are changing. But we always think about, and every American president, really even since Truman, right, Eisenhower, I don't remember him talking about that, but with the exception of Eisenhower, maybe every American president, you know, echoed this platitude that we Americans have the same values as Israel, and that's what binds us, that's what generates the special relationship, and so forth, right? So this also, we need to break that down. What are those values? Because there's nothing static about that. That is also something changing, right? So just briefly, I'll run over some of these. I'll remind you that this was a very unpopular decision. When Harry Truman recognizes Israel in 1948, he's basically the only one who does that in his government, right? Luckily, he was the president. Everyone of any kind of substantial authority was against this. The CIA, we already had CIA, right? So the new CIA was very much against this. Secretary of State George Marshall, famously, right, on the right picture here, he's on Truman's left, right? George Marshall was against this. James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, they were all against this, bitterly against this. They warned Truman against doing this. They said, first of all, this is against our interest, right? You're going to alienate the Arabs, the Arab oil, they're going to go to the Soviets, and we're going to have to come and help the Israelis. That was the fear, that the U.S. would have to send troops to Israel to save this young country that's not going to be able to fend for itself. And Truman nevertheless goes against the grain for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to get into. And he makes a remarkable decision, and he recognizes Israel against all of the senior staff, right? That's kind of recommending and urging him not to do so, right? So that's kind of the beginning, but there's nothing really there. Truman recognizes Israel, but for 15 years, nothing really happens. The U.S. does not sell Israel weapons. It does not support Israel diplomatically. Right? Our patron, sort of speaking, is France in the 50s and 60s. We forget about that. But this changes in the 60s, right? Everything, this special relationship. President Kennedy, of course, coins that phrase when he talks to Golda Meir, who was Israel's foreign minister, and she comes to visit him in 62, and he says, we and you, we have a special relationship. That's where the term comes from. And what leads to that? So here I'll just break down some of the stuff I mentioned earlier. Strategic needs, the strategic urgency of the Cold War, of course, right? The encroachments of the Soviets. Here's kind of Brezhnev and Sadat hugging on the bottom right. An attempt to dissuade Israel from pursuing nuclear weapons in the early 60s. This was a big deal, right? Kennedy thought that by giving Israel Hawk missiles and defensive weapon system, he could dissuade them from doing that. That, of course, wasn't the case. The stability of American allies in the region. There's a very young King Hussein on the right, the king of Jordan. His son Abdullah is now the king. That he needed to be saved quite often, right? There's in the 50s and the 60s, in the early 70s, many times that the regime was threatened, and there was always this idea that Israel would be able to help doing that, but also every time the U.S. gives advanced weapons to Jordan, it kind of has to give to Israel. That's how it works. So that indirectly, the unintended consequences of that also, I think, was that it strengthened U.S.-Israel ties. And of course, the Six-Day War. Right, here's Moshe Dayan, the great hero, the Secretary of Defense in Israel during the Six-Day War. Americans are blown away by that. They're blown away by that because what are Americans doing in 1967? Right, they're losing in Vietnam. And they see these Israelis, right, who are kicking, excuse my language, but they're kicking ass with American weapons, the beginning of the new American weapons that begin arriving in the mid-60s to Israel. And that begins to change because Americans are losing. Here's a winner, right? And if you know anything about Americans like to bet on a winner. Right? Certainly during the Cold War, right? So that's that evolution from a client state early on to a strategic partner. Gradually, Americans discover that Israel is serving America's national security needs. It's not philanthropy. It's not charity. It's not even the Jewish stuff or religious stuff or shared values. At the beginning, Israel is helping America win the Cold War, all right? And that's the most important thing for American policymakers in both in both parties. I'll give just some examples. You might remember, you might know this. The Mossad, the intelligence that Israel is able to provide in the 50s and 60s is very important, right? The secret speech that Khrushchev gives in 1956 in the 20th Party Congress, where he kind of, exposes Stalinism. The Mossad arranges that. That's material, it's a huge propaganda victory for the US. The Mossad is very vital in securing that tape. In 1966, there's an Iraqi MiG that Mossad is able to kind of get to, to engineer this whole thing where he defects with the airplane, and it's the first time Americans have access to a MiG-21. Right, so these are just Americans see gradually that Israel is a very good partner. In 1970, in the Black September, in the civil war in Jordan, Israel threatens to, it doesn't intervene militarily, but it threatens to do so. And Nixon, here's that compliment that Kissinger conveys to Rabin, right, from Nixon, that the president's never going to forget, right, for kind of the way Israel helped, especially Jordan, helped save Jordan by threatening Syria and deterring Syria. And by the 70s, it's clear that Israel is a very good strategic partner, and therefore the relationship's going to consolidate and institutionalize. So that's the national security aspect. Ask yourselves, after the end of the Cold War, is that security aspect still as strong and powerful as it was before? I don't know. That is a great question, right? 9/11, the war on terror kind of reinvented that, said Americans need the strategic partnership. Now Iran, right? Israel as a vital partner, strategic partner to contain Iran. Are these at the same level of the Soviets? I'm not sure, but this is right. These are some of the questions when we talk about that. When we think about domestic politics, right? So I'm moving from the strategic national security aspect to domestic politics. This is something relatively new. AIPAC, the pro-Israel pact is something that really in the 1970s becomes consequential. In the 50s and 60s, there's always been a pro-Israel lobby, but it wasn't that influential and it wasn't that strong. In the 70s, it becomes as influential, partly, right? It's not that there are more Jews or Jews are becoming richer or more influential, partly because of changes within the GOP, right? And first and foremost, the transformation of the Republican Party. In 1980, it becomes the evangelical party de facto, right? Before that, evangelicals do not vote around, political issues. They vote around a lot of different things. The success of Reagan, what is called the so-called Reagan Revolution in 1980, is that it mobilizes for the first time evangelical voters into the GOP, right? And that's going to be so consequential for Israel because it's the same moment when a certain form of what we call premillennial dispensationalism. It's a certain, I won't get into fundamentalist Protestant theology, but it's a certain expression of a belief in end times, of the apocalypse, right? This very hermeneutic approach to reading the Bible as a literal text, right? And all these things really that happened within American Christianity in the 60s and 70s, the climax in the 1980s, because you have this group that's become politicized, literally it's institutionalized through organizations like the Moral Majority, led by here's Jerry Falwell, the Reverend Jerry Falwell, right? Here he is with Reagan. I always find it telling that the first thing Menachem Begin does in 1981, after Israel bombs the nuclear reactor in Osirak in Iraq, right, and destroys that, he calls Jerry Falwell, right? He doesn't call any Jewish leader or something, he calls Jerry Falwell because he understands how powerful and influential he is, especially within the context of the Reagan administration and the Republican Party, in order to explain what Israel did and try to gain, garner support among grassroots Republicans. So this becomes a big deal in the 80s, right? And this is this is probably the most important thing within this pro-Israel lobby that combines, of course, with Jewish philanthropists, with AIPAC, with a lot of these organizations, the Conference of Jewish Presidents, who lobby on behalf of Israel, right? And they're very Zionist. And that's legitimate, by the way. American law allows you to do that. It invites you to do that. There's an Irish American lobby, a Taiwanese American lobby that used to be immensely powerful in the 40s and 50s. We forget, Chiang Kai-shek was a dominant figure in America during the early Cold War. Huge lobby. Pakistan has a huge lobby. I went to a lot of events for Pakistan. Saudis have a very active lobby in Washington, right? So it's just, again, it's a question why people always look at the Jews. One way is to say, because they're the most successful. Another is the more nefarious one, right? That leads us to this, really, right? I'll just say the dark side, really, of the Israel lobby debate is this. There's always been criticism of this, right? Part of it is legitimate, and this was mentioned here, in the fact that why are so many American tax-paying dollars going to Israel? That's a legitimate question for an American to ask, right? So, someone like Nixon, someone like Reagan would answer and say, because it's vital to your national security. It's helping us, contain the Soviets, and that's fair, right? Today, I think it's a much more difficult thing to answer. I think that's Netanyahu realizes that, Trump realizes that as well. But nevertheless, there's great pushback against this idea of the pro-Israel lobby. Part of it is anti-Semitic. Certainly people like Nick Fuentes, Candace Owen, if you don't know them, I envy you, but you're gonna have to know them because they're very influential, unfortunately, right? We're talking about someone like Tucker, who's got 20 to 30 million people, listen and subscribe to him on Spotify, YouTube. That is a lot of power. That's the heart of MAGA, and that's the future of the American right. Unfortunately, I say this, and many of them. Some of them have legitimate criticism. I think it's legitimate to ask, why are you giving Israel so much money? It's illegitimate to suggest that this is part of this conspiratorial kind of Jewish cabal that pulls the strings and leads and orients American foreign policy to serve Israel, right? So that's right. So, but this is in the background. And this, I think the Israel lobby is under immense strain, maybe the greatest strain that it's ever faced. I'm briefly running through this because I know how am I with time? 10 minutes, all right, so. I'll also leave time for questions if anyone has. Right, so we talked about the national security aspect. We talked about domestic politics. And there are other groups within America that support Israel in terms of domestic politics, but that has changed. Up until 1967, the most fervent pro-Israel group were African Americans. I mean, you have rallies in 48 and 56. In 67, you have rallies in Harlem. I used to live on 110th Street in Central Park North. You had like thousands of people, and African Americans were raising money for Israel, right? So that's kind of, and unfortunately, that's kind of, that left us already. That's a different reality. But different groups in America supported Israel for different reasons over time. And this feeds into the shared values, right? Why do they do that? Because they think that we have a certain affinity as Americans and Israelis. We share certain values. And here I'm very skeptical, and everything's with the question mark because that's not the world we live in anymore, unfortunately. That's the world of 50, 60 years ago. Here's George Meany, right? George Meany, I'm writing a book about this, so I'm very excited about it. George Meany is the head of the AFL-CIO, right? In the climax of American labor in 50s and 60s, immensely powerful organization. And here's George Meany, who is literally Golda Meir's best friend. They have a very close relationship. American labor unions, right? We're talking here at the height of American labor, when 10, 15% of the labor force, of the American labor force was unionized, supported Israel. Avidly supported Israel, so much that you have buildings here. People don't realize that. You have buildings all over Israel built by American labor, right? By the industrial workers, the meatpacking workers, electrical unions. And they did that because they believed that Americans in Israel share liberal democracy, progressive values, social democracy, equality, social justice, right? This idea of Israel as, quote, the only democracy in the Middle East, right? This is partly one of the reasons that a lot of Americans on the left, I mean, yeah, people forget, the left loved Israel. That's the title of my book, by the way. The left loved Israel up until about 10, 15, 20 years ago, when that really begins to transform, the American left loved Israel much more than the right. And it's this idea that here we're democracies, we believe in social justice, in social democracy, in equality. And also another very important component here is the pioneering stuff, right? The pioneering. Here's Little House on the Prairie. And here's a kibbutz in a New York Times magazine from the 1950s. And it's this idea that, look, what the Israelis are doing is what we did, right? Obviously, it's laundered history, right? It's kind of sanitized from the experience of ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, right? But it's this idea that what the pioneers did in America in the 19th century, the Israelis are doing, right? It's the same thing. So they draw that parallel, and it's a very powerful force, cultural force for Americans. I always like to give this analogy. This is of course, the great Paul Newman, right? One of the great actors as the Sundance Kid and Butch Cassidy, right? One of the great Westerns, kind of, from the late 60s. But it's the same Paul Newman that's also Ari Ben Knan, right? This is Exodus. This is kind of one of the great films ever, really, about Israel, right? From 1960, the Otto Preminger film Exodus. And it's like, that's the analogy that Americans are making. The new Tzabar, the new Israeli Zionist hero in Israel, is like the cowboy, right? It's like the American pioneer. So that's also a very potent force in shaping the shared values. And of course, now I don't know how relevant that is, right? And that's why I have the question mark. The shared values we had 40, 50, 60 years ago tying Israel and America, I don't know if you can find them in Israel, and I don't know if you can find them in America. So if we still have shared values, those values have altered, right? We can argue about that. That's a big part of the debate in Israel and America. But I find it very ironic that, right, here is, right, this is a demonstration against Netanyahu's judicial reforms, right? It's not reforms, it's far more sweeping, but that's how he called it. So the judicial reforms that Netanyahu is doing, you will never be a dictator, to protest against Trump from a few months ago, of course, the No Kings rally. And it's this idea that both of these countries are kind of gravitating towards autocracy and illiberal democracy. And that also, unfortunately, I think, is something that for some right-wing MAGA Americans and some right-wing Israelis, especially these two in the middle, right? The settler, you know, the more radical settler, I'll try to be polite, part of this right-wing Israeli government, right? And suddenly that's becoming the shared values. And if that's the shared values, the Mike Huckabee, who's of course the American ambassador to Jerusalem, very nice guy, by the way, but also, you know, a religious fundamentalist, self-described, right? I'm not saying this in a pejorative manner, who's very close to the Israeli right, the settler right, the Haredi right. And if that's now the new values shaping, then think about what does that mean for the future of U.S.-Israel relations, and maybe I'll conclude with that, right? I don't have a lot of time. This is just a reminder that the history of U.S.-Israel relations is a history of conflict and debate. It's never, you know, smooth. No international relationship is, but we have ups and downs constantly. So what we're seeing now, what we saw with Biden, is really it's a part of a much longer history of negotiating this relationship and having ups and downs. And I'll just conclude with this then, with looking to the future. I think it's very, obviously as a historian I look to the past, not to the future, but it's very difficult to think that the special relationship as it was in the last 50, 60 years is going to continue in the same way. There's different reasons for that, right? I won't go much into that, but we see this all across the board in terms of polling. All of the different segments of American society, all of them that supported Israel, unquestionably are older, and as happens, unfortunately, to everyone, all of us who are older, eventually we die, as voters I'm talking about, in a demographic. And what do we have left? We have the Democratic Party, and people who identify as Democrats, a majority of which for over a year have constantly been aligning more with Palestinians than with Israelis, and saying that, we don't support Israel anymore. This is a remarkable shift. Again, many reasons for that. Part of them are demographic, part of them are internal to, America's multicultural, ethnic transformation, but many of them have to do with Israel and Israel's behavior and Israel's transformation, and we can't, put our head in the sand and say, oh, it's only because of America becoming kind of more, less white or less Christian, which isn't the case at all, right? Much of it is generated by Israeli actions, unfortunately. And again, all across the board, on the left, we know this. Republicans are younger Republicans are much less supportive and more apathetic towards Israel than their parents. And evangelicals, and I finish with evangelicals because we take them for granted. I mentioned Netanyahu thinks it's the 1980s and that the 1980s never change. So of course, we know that undoubtedly now empirical research in the last 5-10 years, younger evangelicals, I'm not going to say they're not against Israel, but they just don't care that much. And that matters so much because, when in moments of crises in the 80s and the 90s, I attended some of these rallies, I remember, in New York, when Israel, got in trouble in 1987, I think, because there was an incident in the Har HaBayit, in the Temple Mount, where Israeli police killed a few Palestinians. I remember thousands of evangelicals came and protested. I was there. I was a Jew living in New York. And you're not going to get that today, right? Because you don't have that energy, that support. You have apathy among under 30 evangelicals. They're like, okay, maybe Israel's important and everything, but it's like the 10th thing on their list. It's not going to be as important. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, this is the old generation of evangelicals. They would say our primary goals in politics are ending abortion and securing Israel. You don't have that anymore with the evangelicals, and that's vital, right? Because when I look ahead to the future, this is the future of the left, partly, unless Israel changes, right? This is, of course, a huge demonstration with thousands of people on the lawn at Columbia University, right? Here's kind of the famous Butler University, where Butler Hall was the library where I spent many, many nights. This is the future of the American left, just demographically speaking, and this is the future of the American right. And none of these people, by the way, Tucker is a kingmaker. We'll see who he's going to support next. You know, J.D. Vance, the vice president, wants to be the heir. None of these people here are sympathetic to Israel. Some of them are quite hostile to Israel, right? So again, I don't want to paint a bleak picture. You still have some bipartisanship on the Democratic side. Unfortunately, it's diminishing on the Republican. You still have a lot of mainstream Republicans who support Israel. But the day after Trump, that Republican Party is moving in a very anti-Israel direction. And if we've already lost the left, what are we left with? Right? So, I apologize I have to end on such a bleak observation, but I think I'll do that nonetheless. Thank you. Do I have time for questions, or are we already done? Okay, so if anyone...
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Frommer. We have time only for one question. If someone would like to ask Dr. Frommer a question before we move on. Okay, so we will be moving on to our second session. We're going to be changing gears a little bit. So this session is going to be examining the evolving challenges facing American Jewry, such as political polarization and rising anti-Semitism. Our first speaker in this session is Dr. Carl Jonker, who's the academic director of the Irwin Cotler Institute. So Dr. Jonker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I guess Yoav just stepped out, but to be a bearer of bad news, some of those people that he said you might not know about, you're about to know about. So I think Yoav's talk really set the stage nicely for my talk, and I think Ophir's talk after mine, to go a little bit more into depth on challenges facing the Jewish community. And I'm going to focus more on a challenge that's emanating from the political right. It can be defined in many different ways, whether that's the far right, the extreme right, but to understand that the American right now, the conservative movement, is very divided, and that there's a struggle going on. Now, this struggle isn't new, but it's come out into the open. And you saw this, especially in recent months, basically the last 4 or 5 months, after Nick Fuentes, who I'll speak about here in a little bit, was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. And the dynamic that I want to speak about here really focuses on mainstreaming. The mainstreaming of anti-Semitic ideas and anti-Semitic thoughts, notions, narratives, within the mainstream of American discourse. I think if you ask me, or if Brandon and even Yoav, when they were growing up, some of the things that we hear in the political discourse in America and the United States, especially when it comes to racist ideas, was really on the margins. It was delegitimized. It wasn't part of the public discourse in the same way that it appears now. So with that said, how many of you heard about the synagogue that was burned in Mississippi about 10 days ago? Okay. So for those of you that don't know, on January 10th, in the early morning hours, a fire devastated the Beth Israel Synagogue congregation in Jackson, Mississippi. This was a historic synagogue. It's the oldest synagogue, the largest synagogue in all of Mississippi. And federal authorities quickly found that it was targeted in an arson attack. And the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, is a 19-year-old college baseball player who, in the indictment against him, said that he did it because he described the building as, quote, the synagogue of Satan, and that it had Jewish ties. Now, I'm not going to make any sort of ideological claim on what led to his violent act, other than saying, this was obviously a motivation. But this narrative, the synagogue of Satan, or that it has Jewish ties, I want to talk about as a climate. There's a climate that exists, and there's a language that exists in which older religious language and themes are coming into political discourse and are forged with modern conspiratorial politics. So it makes it easier for people to consider or to perceive the Jewish community or Jewish houses of worship or Jewish places not as a synagogue or not as a religious community, but as an enemy, as the other, as an outsider. And what I want to focus on today is a specific subset within the far right, and that is Christian nationalists, Christian nationalism. How many of you have heard of Christian nationalism? Okay. And I want to talk about how certain Christian nationalists and Christian nationalism in general has helped to mainstream some of these ideas and these anti-Semitic narratives within the American worldview. And when I talk about Christian nationalism, I'm not talking about Christians just going out and voting, just participating in the political process. I'm talking about a worldview that's defined as a cultural framework that blurs distinctions between Christian identity and American identity, that seeks to preserve this union of an American Christian identity, and it's grounded in this belief that the American nation is of, by, and for Christians, not anyone else. Of Christians, by Christians, and for Christians. In this worldview, the state should promote a particular Christian moral order, and Christians need to pursue political and cultural power in order to dominate America's social and political life. And in this case, if Christians are dominating, then all other groups, religious groups, are marginalized. Sometimes these marginalized groups, whether that's Jews, Hindus, whatnot, Muslims, are cast as an internal threat in different ways. During the last election, there was a Republican presidential candidate that was running for the nomination, Vivek Ramaswamy, who was Hindu. And many Christian nationalists attacked him for being Hindu. There's Christian national attacks on J.D. Vance's wife, who is also a practicing Hindu, and suggesting that somehow because he's married to a Hindu, then he's not trustworthy or not reliable or not a true Christian. And this has sparked all sorts of rumors. Now, to understand why anti-Semitism has appeared more frequently in this environment, another concept that I want to talk about that's useful for understanding is populism. And populism being a political style that frames the world as a moral struggle, a deathly struggle between the people and a corrupt and conspiring elite. It's good versus evil. It's a binary worldview that divides. There's no gray area. It's either good or evil, right or wrong, good and bad, insider or outsider. And in this worldview, Christian nationalism adopts this same kind of moral binary. It positions itself as the voice of the true people, the true American Christian, and portrays elites and Jews and others as outsiders and outside forces that are trying to undermine Christian hegemony, Christian dominance in the United States. And it's telling that elites or non-Christians can be described in different ways, whether that's secular, liberal, Jewish, Muslim, it doesn't matter. But they're all blamed for persecuting Christians and corrupting the nation. This helps explain why anti-Semitism in particular is an unusually useful tool in their political repertoire and in their political language. Jews can be cast simultaneously as insiders and outsiders, elite and alien. They can be cast as American, but also outside, whether that's Israel or Jews from outside trying to influence internal American politics. They're a flexible target. They're a target that can explain moral decline, social decline, moral disorder, foreign wars, institutional betrayal. Anything that you can think of, Jews can be blamed for in a Christian nationalist framework. Christian nationalism and those Christian nationalists that promulgate anti-Semitism is part of a larger phenomenon within the United States, something that Yoav touched on a little bit. But it comes at a time where more and more Americans believe or adhere to or adopt anti-Semitic tropes and narratives as believing that they're true. A 2024 survey found that 24% of Americans believe at least 6 anti-Semitic tropes or more. And more research surveys that have been done, if you look at younger generations, younger Republicans, younger Democrats, more and more have younger people have less favorable views of Jews, not only of Israel, but of Jews in general. And when you look at hate crimes in the United States, over 70% of all religious-based hate crimes are targeting Jews. Jews are by far the largest target of hate crimes. You see, and we've talked about this to the fellows and elsewhere, you see the online presence and the digital world have enabled the circulation of these ideas, these conspiracies. And it's a place where anti-Semitic narratives and tropes and ideas and conspiracies just can be further advanced, further propagated. Now, this all intensified after October 7th, and that's when you also got an uptick in anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, and anti-Semitic content across online spaces, also in public spheres. And this has been aided, again, because of social media and online spaces that enable you to promulgate these ideas faster without any sort of filter, and they go beyond borders. So with that kind of framing in place, I want to talk specifically about 3 people, 3 Christian nationalists, all self-described as Christian nationalists, that are important figures. They're not the only figures, but are important figures that have played a role in mainstreaming anti-Semitic narratives within the right, within the conservative movement, and also within the larger American context. The first one is Rick Wiles, who I would call an apocalyptic pastor, broadcaster. I'll go into depth a little bit about him in a bit. The second is Andrew Torba, who's a platform builder and someone who believes in creating a parallel society. He's the founder of Gab, which is an alternative to Facebook and Twitter. And then the last is Nick Fuentes, who Yoav mentioned, who's a live streamer, a provocateur, who has worked very hard in the last 5 years or so, 7 years, 8 years, to basically upend the Republican Party. That's what he wants to do. He wants to infiltrate the conservative movement and make the conservative movement and transform it into his image. And his presence online has grown. He was just interviewed again by Tucker Carlson, who was interviewed a few weeks ago, or I guess this was in December, by Piers Morgan, also getting millions and millions of views. So his reach has expanded greatly. So first to Rick Wiles. Rick Wiles is a Florida-based pastor and the founder of True News, which is a media outlet that has been built, or he's built around conspiratorial commentary and end times theology. He's been active since the late 1990s. He started as a radio show jockey and then transferred onto the internet as the internet became more popular. He's always been conspiratorial, but it really wasn't until 2019 that he began to engage more and more with anti-Semitic conspiracies in his broadcasts, in his messages, and then completely went kind of off the rails after October 7th in 2023. And essentially since 2023, anti-Semitism has become a defining feature of his worldview that he urges his audience to adopt. And it's a lens through which he wants his audience to interpret world affairs and affairs in the United States. So how does this work in practice? On the issue of abortion, Wiles frames the issue as a religious battle between Christianity and Judaism. He claims that abortion would not exist in America without the powerful, influential, rich Jews. And he uses that claim to say that by reasserting Christian dominance, by resisting the imposition of Judaism and the Jewish idea of, slaughtering babies, that this will help combat that phenomenon. When it comes to politics, I know it's a long memory, but there was a time when Donald Trump was impeached. And when Donald Trump was impeached, he came out and said, he called it a Jew coup, that Donald Trump was trying to be overthrown by a Jewish cabal, and that Jews were deceiving and trying to plot the takeover of the U.S. government by removing Donald Trump. He's extended this conspiracy to other elections, to talking about how Jews want to remove rights from everyday American citizens, and he's refers consistently to Jews as the power of the Antichrist, or as the Antichrist. He thinks that American foreign policy is controlled by satanic Zionists. He explicitly refers to Jews and Israel as the synagogue of Satan, and he frames wars abroad and conflict at home as a spiritual battlefield. And it's this rhetoric, this synagogue of Satan, which actually comes from the book of Revelation. It comes from Scripture, that saying, the synagogue of Satan. So this is, again, it's rhetoric that's based on a specific Christian interpretation. When it comes to October 7th and what's been going on in Gaza, in Israel's response to Hamas's attack, he frequently describes Israel as satanic, Bibi Netanyahu as satanic. He calls the IDF the Antichrist army, and he consistently uses dehumanizing rhetoric and language against Israel. Now, I'm not saying that Wiles himself, or even, to return to Mississippi, that Wiles was someone who influenced this person, but this rhetoric of the synagogue of Satan, as we'll see also with Torba, has become far more common and accessible to people. It's rhetoric that I never heard, when I was growing up, and that was also a moment when, say, the far right and the militia movement in the United States was far more prominent. Christian identity was prominent in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The second person that I want to speak about is Andrew Torba. Torba is an interesting case. He founded Gab, which is an online platform that was meant to rival Facebook and Twitter. How many of you have heard of Gab? Very few of you. Basically, he thought that Twitter was too restrictive, that it was that it didn't allow for true freedom of speech, true freedom of expression. So he created Gab to be an alternative haven for the far right or for anyone to share whatever they wanted, whether that's conspiratorial views, anti-Semitic views, hateful views, and without any sort of filter or content moderation. Don't go there if you don't have to. It's a cesspool of hate. But he created Gab as this alternative platform of free speech. But Gab as an idea for Torba extends beyond the digital realm, and it extends beyond just this platform. He wants to create a separate society, a parallel society for Christians in America. So many of you guys have probably used PayPal. He created a separate payment system called Gab Pay. He urges Christians, those who would identify as Christian nationalists, to only purchase goods and services from fellow Christians. He wants to create a parallel economy, a parallel society. If you look at some of the things that he posts, a lot of it harkens back to, say, Nazi imagery of the pure Aryan family with a mother, a father, 2 kids. This is the proper unit, but very, very conservative views. As of November 2025, he had over 4.5 million followers on Gab, and that's only just a small reach that he has. Most of his rhetoric and what he's also tried to position himself as is kind of a theologian of Christian nationalism. Several years ago, he published a book called basically the Christian Nationalist Manifesto with a pastor named Andrew Isker. And the two of them together have basically tried to position themselves as the head theologians and the head propagators of what American Christian nationalism should be. It's debatable, what their actual place is in that or whatnot, but that's what they're trying to accomplish. And one of the fundamental things that Torba rejects, and others that you'll hear them reject, is this idea of Judeo-Christian culture and Judeo-Christian society. Instead, they argue that Christianity and Judaism are totally distinct and incompatible and irreconcilable religions. There's no such thing as Judeo-Christian civilization, or that Judeo-Christian somehow forms the basis of Western civilization and Western ideas. He consistently, like Wiles, refers to Judaism as the synagogue of Satan. He embraces a belief of replacement theology, which is a teaching refuted by many Christians, that the church replaces the Jews as God's chosen people. And he again insists that there's no shared foundation or link between Jews and Christians whatsoever. After October 7th, again, we see an increase and an intensification of his propagation of these views. He's unapologetic about it. He calls the U.S. House, Zionist-occupied government, which is the Zog government, which is an old phrase from the far right in the 1980s, 1970s. He declares that there's no room for Zionists, i.e. no room for Jews in the Christian nationalist movement, and frames the movement's demands as being clear and reasonable, and saying that Christians need to overtake the institutions of government because right now they are occupied by Jews. Now, with the time that I have remaining, I'll speak briefly on Nick Fuentes, who's perhaps sadly the most popular of the three and the most influential, I would argue, and has done more for normalizing anti-Semitic expressions and ideas within mainstream conservative discourse than anyone else. If you look at Fuentes as kind of being on the margins and Tucker Carlson being here, you see how it's laundered into the middle. So when someone like Tucker Carlson interviews Fuentes, or when Donald Trump meets Fuentes for dinner at Mar-a-Lago like he did a few years ago, he's given credence, he's given credibility that he otherwise wouldn't have, and it comes into the mainstream, it's laundered. It comes into the mainstream of the Republican and conservative movement. He rose to notoriety in 2017 in particular when he launched his America First live stream. America First is the statement. It harkens back to the 1930s and not a new statement at all. It's not neutral branding, but again, it has this deep resonance within the far right in America that links to a threat of quote-unquote international Jewry that undermines America and undermines Christian civilization. One of the things that distinguishes Fuentes is his ability to communicate. He's an excellent communicator. Early on, he communicates mostly through the use of humor and sarcasm. He tries to, play off, I'm going to say what I want, I'm just trying to get a rise out of people, I'm not being serious. But the more that he keeps saying it, it's very clear that he is very much serious. And over time, he has shifted from this use of plausible deniability to just repeatedly using these tropes of Jewish control and malign influence even more and more. Like Torba, he rejects this idea of Judeo-Christian civilization. He argues that Jews are not part of Western civilization because they're not Christian. He argues that Jews have too much power in the United States. And he bluntly states that it's Christians that should have all the power in the United States, no one else. When it comes to some of the main ideas that he talks about, and especially in terms of after October 7th and elsewhere, he just expresses a general hatred. He'll refer to American Jews as double agents. He'll call out American Jews as serving only Israel, which again was mentioned earlier on. He calls for their punishment, the punishment and even deportation of Jews from the United States, and argues that the conservative movement needs to be independent of Zionists. So that is Nick Fuentes in a nutshell. What all three have in common is a shared idea and narratives that there's Jewish domination, control of the media, control of finance, that Jews are starting wars and revolutions, and they use long-standing religious tropes, such as Jews killing Christ, promoting moral degradation, and other things, to influence and take America in a direction that it shouldn't go in, which is downward. With that, I'll close. Is there time for questions? Okay, if anyone has any questions, happy to take some. Yeah. 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 So I think in terms of the differences between American and European, say, Christian nationalism, a lot of it does have to do with, I don't think European Christian nationalism comes out of the evangelical movement as much. It's a different history of the church in Europe and where you are in Europe than in the United States especially. One of the ideas that really underpins some of the Christian nationalist ideas is an ideology known as Christian identity or British Israelism. And this has been an undercurrent within the American far right, not necessarily just Christian nationalists, that again asserts, this Christian identity, that Christians are the true Israel or God's people and chosen ones. When you look at surveys of who, the makeup of Christian nationalists, yes, overwhelmingly evangelical. Nick Fuentes is a Catholic. Torba is evangelical, and Wiles is evangelical. So you get Catholics, you get evangelicals. It's overwhelmingly white, but you also do have some Hispanics and African Americans that are also adherents to Christian nationalism as well. Yeah.
Do you think after the murder of Charlie Kirk, the movement got itself figures were behind, and can we expect more violent terms?
I think it was definitely a moment, but I don't see that rallying happening necessarily because it's part of this larger struggle, the struggle between, Charlie Kirk's vision, and then on the other side, other people, Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, others that are young and trying to shape the future of the Republican Party. I guess one last question.
When you described Turban, actually it's personally to me like martyrism.
Mm.
And together with your question, it goes together like they are against the official dialogue that the Catholics are doing, not only the Catholics are doing between Catholic Christianity and Judaism.
Yeah.
And if you speak about if we resonate martyrism, it is against the Christian dogma.
Yeah.
So
There's a lot of, Fuentes will claim that he's, a Catholic, a very strong Catholic. But when it comes to certain aspects of Catholic doctrine and Vatican II and other things, he'll say that he's fine with it, and then he'll go and say something else, a few days later. So he's always changing his views. Thank you very much.
So thank you once again, Dr. Jonker. So our next speaker in this session is Ms. Ofir Dayan from the Institute for National Security Studies. Ms. Dayan, the floor is yours.
And presentation? Perfect. Okay, if you don't mind, I'll speak from here because I'm not as tall as the other speakers today. So good, let's see, it already is afternoon. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. And following the amazing lecture that we heard before and the lectures before it, I would like to take a step back and look more broadly on challenges facing the Jewish communities, specifically in the United States in the recent, let's say, 2.5 years since October 7th, 2023. I think we all understand intuitively that something major changed after October 7th, 2023. I can attest myself. I did my bachelor's and my master's at Columbia University, which was a very hostile university even before October 7th. But October 7th unleashed things that we haven't seen before on college campuses, but also in the streets. The fact is that synagogues became a prime location for protests these days, and this is something that we need to recognize. I would like to first start with discussing the major things that are shifting how the American Jewish community is now being perceived and is perceiving its surroundings. So the first thing that was already discussed by the former lecturer, which I think he did a very good job, so I'm not going to repeat it at length, is the rise of Christian white nationalism that brings with it certain elements of classic anti-Semitism. The second thing is the rise of the far left. The epitome is Zoran Mamdani in New York, and we're going to speak about him at length, but he's only a symptom to a larger phenomena of radicalization in the Democratic Party, as much as there is radicalization to the other side in the Republican Party. And then, of course, the major event that turned the world upside down, October 7th, 2023, when a few thousands of Hamas terrorists invaded Israel. But the influences of October 7th obviously did not remain in the territorial borders of Israel. They changed the lives, and I think I'm not exaggerating here, they changed the lives of Jewish communities in the diaspora. Before the war in 2020, Pew did a survey, and the survey discovered that 82% of American Jews perceive Israel as being an important part of their Jewish identity. Okay, it's not very different than Korean Americans or Chinese Americans, but it means that for Jews, Israel is a very important aspect of their Jewish identity. Then comes October 7th, and it puts three very distinct, very prominent challenges in the face of American Jewish community. The first one is obviously the one that became apparent on October 7th, 6:29 a.m. Israel time, is that Israel is at risk. And for American Jewish communities, and as much as it is for European Jewish communities, Israel is a refuge. It is a strong nation that is able to defend itself, and this is the place where you run to when you are in problems. And all of a sudden it changed. Now Israel is having security issues. Now Israel is the one that is unable to defend its own citizens. And I think it's no less than a real existential crisis for many Jews in the diaspora that were used to seeing Israel in a certain way, and now Israel is perceived in a whole different way. And it's not just that Israel was unable to protect its citizens as it should have, because that's the function, the core functioning of a state. All of a sudden, they see other people viewing Israel as a country that is unable to protect its citizens. It's not just the Israelis and the Jews in the diaspora. We've seen cannibalism of all different nations that now look at Israel after October 7th as a weak nation, and they can prey on, and they can have their say and criticize Israel in a way that wasn't there before. The second challenge is when those sentiments arrived at home, at their home. In Europe, in Canada, in the United States, and lately also in Sydney, Australia, the communities themselves were being targeted in a way they weren't targeted before. All of a sudden, as I said in my opening statement, synagogues are prime locations for protests. And it's happening everywhere, all across the Western world. And there's almost a conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So when the protester goes to a synagogue and spray paints Free Palestine on a synagogue, is it anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? Because the message is clearly anti-Zionism, but he chose a synagogue. He didn't choose AIPAC headquarters in Washington, D.C. He chose a synagogue to send a message that for those people, the perpetrators, Israel and Jews are the same. And all the Jews are to blame for Israel's actions, and therefore the Free Gaza should be spray painted on a synagogue and not any other location. Just a side note on that, the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, has a definition for anti-Semitism that is the most, I think, commonly used nowadays. It has been adopted by several US states, by many international nations and international organizations. And this definition clearly states that when one blames a Jew for the actions of Israel, it is anti-Semitism. So this is what we're seeing now in the Western world. And the third challenge is the all eyes on Gaza phenomenon. This wasn't just a social media trend. It was far more than that. It's a shift from looking at a situation as it is. So, for example, if October 7th was a horrible massacre of Jews that we need to condemn, now we don't need to condemn that anymore because all eyes on Gaza. And because Gaza is the only thing that matters right now. And it doesn't matter if Jews are being slaughtered by the masses in Israel, because what matters now is that we concentrate all our efforts on what Israel is doing. And that put people, Jews in the Western world in a big conflict. And I'm going to give just one example. I think we all saw the protests at American college campuses since October 7th. So when Jewish students were being abused by their fellow students of other nationalities, and when they go to complain to the universities don't want to handle with that anymore. Because for them, this is not the situation that we need to worry about right now. And when the protesters push out Jewish students from campus at Columbia, it was very prominent what they did like a human chain, held hands, and every time a Zionist would go into campus, and I challenge you to figure out how they knew who is a Zionist and who isn't, because I'm pretty certain that they don't walk around with a huge plaque saying I'm a Zionist, so be my guest and go wild in your imagination. They held hands, and every time someone would come into campus, they would scream, "There's a Zionist in the camp, push the Zionist out of the camp." And what Columbia did in response, I'm not going to let you guess because it is so absurd that I don't think you're going to guess that. They said to the Jewish students, if you really want to, you can study the rest of your semester online and not come to campus. And instead of punishing the perpetrators, they punish the victim. And then I would like to dive a bit more in. I would not talk a lot about the other side because Carl discussed it very well before me, so I'm going to talk a bit about the Mamdani debate. 33% of American Jewish New Yorkers voted for Zoran Mamdani. 33% of Jewish American New Yorkers voted for a person who said in his own voice that he does not believe a Jewish state has a right to exist. Let me put it more accurately. He was asked whether or not he thought Israel has a right to exist, and he said, I do think Israel has a right to exist, but not as a Jewish state, which means Israel does not have a right to exist, but that's because that's a core characteristic of Israel. And yet 33% of Jews in New York voted for him. And I think we all ask ourselves why. So obviously there's the clear reasons that apply to everyone in New York and not just for Jews. So obviously there are a lot of people, many people in New York who are blue no matter who. So no matter who's on the Democratic ticket, they are going to vote for him. And that applies to the general populations, but also for Jews. The second thing that we must recognize is that the contenders against Zoran Mamdani were extremely weak, extremely. So we have the Republican candidate that, who didn't really have a chance to begin with, but it doesn't help that it's the same person running for more than 20 years and he's wearing a red beret screaming at people at the subway. And then you have two other contenders, the former mayor, Eric Adams, who was investigated for corruption and receiving money directly from Turkey. And if it's not bad enough that he's corrupt, the only reason that he's not in jail right now is President Trump, who saved him. So for a Democrat in New York, it's not only that you're corrupt, but you were saved by President Trump. Obviously, you wouldn't vote for someone like that. And the other candidate, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, is great for Israel, but has, if I'm not mistaken, 13 complaints against him for sexual harassment. And although these complaints were never proved to be correct, I'm pretty certain that even some people in this room would not feel comfortable voting for someone who, multiple women said that he sexually abused them. So we're left with Zoran Mamdani and with the reasons that Jews voted for him. So obviously those two reasons, but also because many Jews in New York, specifically younger Jews in New York, said, we believe in his economic ideas. We want what he wants for us, to live affordably here in the city that we love so much, and I must admit it's a great city, I love it too very much. And Israel is important to us, 82%, as we discussed earlier, but it's not that important that we're willing to forgive what he says about Israel because we really believe in his economic principles. And this is something that I wanted to discuss because I think it's a huge rift in the Jewish community. And I'm going to quote a person that I admire, no less, Rabbi Ami Hirsch is a Reform rabbi from New York. And on the first anniversary of October 7th in 2024, and Mamdani was already running for mayor, and he gave a sermon in a synagogue. And he said a sentence that I think caught many by surprise. Again, he's a Reform rabbi. He's a senior leader in the Reform movement. And he said, we raised our children for tikkun olam, but that's not what we meant. And when I interviewed him for my book, Tikkun Olam, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is repairing the world. It's a Jewish principle of showing how Israel can contribute, the Jewish people, Israel can contribute to the world. And when I interviewed for my book, I asked him what he meant by that. And he said, I raised the younger generations of Reform Jews to do Tikkun Olam because they believe that the Jewish people and the state of Israel are doing such positive things in the world that they need to propagate this positive message. And now I realize that I raised them so well to believe in Tikkun Olam that they do it as if it was a Buddhist principle or a Hindu principle, because they do Tikkun Olam not because they believe that Israel is doing good things, just because you need to do good things. And I think that's a rift in the Jewish community in the US at large, but specifically in New York. And I want to end this section about Mamdani with two short things to say. The first thing is that 33% of Jewish New Yorkers are not anti-Zionist. That's not reality. And again, the problem is that Israel is not as important to them as supporting Mamdani's economic principles. And we as Israel need to ask ourselves how we got to a situation where Israel is not important enough for them. And it's not just a critical candidate. It's someone who doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist. And the last thing I'm going to say about Mamdani, and again, it's not Mamdani the person, it's Mamdani as a representative of what's going on in the American left, is that what I'm really scared about for the Jewish community is the divide and conquer that he's doing in the last several months. And I'll give an example. In Hanukkah, every evening he went to light candles with a different anti-Zionist, ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in New York. Every single night. And the message was this: look, I don't hate Jews. Jews are fine. There are Jews that are anti-Zionist and they're great Jews. And there are Jews that are Zionists and they're bad Jews. And me, Zoran Mamdani, who is not Jewish, I'm going to tell you who's the good Jew and who's the bad Jew. And if we think that's not going to penetrate into the Jewish communities themselves, I think we're deceiving ourselves. I'm not going to talk a lot about what's happening on the American right because Carl really nicely put it. But again, whiteization of the conservative movement, the reconnection of the younger generations to their white Christian identity that obviously brings with it some anti-Semitic trends. The net thing is those people are not just influencers, they're getting closer and closer to the White House. We see Tucker Carlson hosting Nick Fuentes and 2 days later dining with President Trump in the White House and in Mar-a-Lago with oil executives after the takeover of Venezuela. And one last thing that I want to mention that I think is dangerous is that, and Carl touched on it, is that Jews are the other. And they're the other in two different ways. They're the other because they're Jews, and they're not us. And they're the other because roughly 75% of Jews vote for the Democratic Party. So they're not us. They're not us, the Republican Party. And they're different because they're Jews and because they don't vote like us. So we don't need to care about them as much. And I'm going to end with how this influences American Jews. American Jews are in a point of isolation because they can't find their place in a rapidly radicalizing Democratic Party, and they can't find their way in a radically changing Republican Party that is getting more and more unfavorable towards Jews. And the last thing I'm going to mention is that they're being pushed away from Israel. And I want to end with this because that's the point where I think this is not just a strategic issue. It's an issue, it's an ideological issue, and where, I ask myself as a Jew, as a citizen of the state of Israel, what we did wrong. And when I look at Israel and its relationship with Jewish diasporas, not just in the US, but in general, I think that we did not do enough to make them feel like we think that they belong. And in a world that is radically changing, and I think very, very soon many Jews in the diaspora would not feel welcome where they live or in the political climate in which they live. Israel should not be a refuge. I assume nobody really wants Jews, experience such anti-Semitism that they have to run and hide here. But we want to make them think that we always have their backs. And we don't, unfortunately. Last week, a member of Knesset proposed to de-recognize conservative and reform conversions. Just to be clear, the chief rabbinate in Israel does not recognize it. The state recognizes it like it recognizes gay marriage. So if you get your conversion abroad and you come here, it is recognized for the purposes of making aliyah. So now even that is going to perhaps be taken away. The Western Wall conundrum with how they can and cannot pray. I overall think that in the last decades or 2 decades, we, the state of Israel, looked at those people, at Jewish diasporas, as one of two things. It's either they're a lobbying firm or they're an ATM. And we wanted Miri Edelson to go to President Trump and pressure him to release the hostages. We love them. And when we want Chaim Saban to donate to Israeli soldiers, we love them. And in the other times, they don't really exist. And if they do, it's not positive. And I'm going to end here with a short story that I tell almost in every lecture that I give, whether it is not relevant, but I tell it anyway. And here it is relevant. And I think it tells the story of how American Jews, specifically Reform and conservatives, which are the vast majority of American Jews, feel right now. In 2018, there was a massacre in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Tree of Life synagogue. It was the worst anti-Semitic incident in the history of the United States, hopefully forever the worst. And the Shabbat after that massacre, I drove to Pittsburgh, and I went to do a Shabbat with that community. And it's a conservative community, and they were hosted in a Reform synagogue because their own synagogue obviously was a crime scene, and they couldn't pray in it 6 days later. And I walk into the synagogue, and there's an Israeli flag on the bima next to where the Torah is, when they store the Torah scrolls. And that's not unusual. Israeli flags are in almost every, in all Zionist, let's say it this way, in all Zionist synagogues in the United States and in Europe. And they pray, and I remind you, this is a community that 6 days before that lost 11 of its members to radical gunmen who entered the synagogue, screamed, "All Jews must die," and killed 11 people. And they pray for the state of Israel and for the soldiers of the IDF. And when they finish praying, the Chazan, the cantor, goes on stage and says, for the national anthem, please rise. And a room full of 500 American Jews sing Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem. A room of 500 Jews did not even occur to one of them that when you say the national anthem, they mean the American anthem. They all knew that in a synagogue you sing Hatikva, the Jewish anthem. And the most important part for me came after the prayer. A man roughly the age of my dad, so 3 times my age, he came up to me and asked me if I'm from Israel, and I said yes. And he said, "You know what? I only have one thing to ask you. When you go home, tell them we're Jewish." And it doesn't happen a lot that I'm speechless. I work at speaking, and it was in 2018, and I still don't have an answer for him. And I stood there, and ever since first of all, I'm telling you that he's Jewish because I promised to. But he's Jewish. There is no doubt about it. He's Jewish. But he thinks that we don't think that he's Jewish because he's conservative. And you know what? I can't blame him. 2 days after the massacre, the chief rabbi of Israel back then was interviewed on radio. And he was asked about this terrorist attack. And he said, yes, it was a horrible massacre in a building with a clear Jewish symbol. What he actually says is that it can't be a synagogue because it's a conservative synagogue. So it's a building with a Star of David on it. It's not a synagogue. It's just a building with a Star of David on it. And I think, when we're looking at, this session is about the challenges facing the Jewish communities. They have immense challenges in the right and in the left of the political spectrum, wherever they are, in Europe, in Canada, in Australia, and the United States. Israel shouldn't be one more challenge. We shouldn't. We must be a solution, not a challenge. And this is what I want to end with, just what's next. So obviously, reaching out to Jewish diaspora, it's our job. It's the Jewish state, not just those of the Israeli state. And the last thing is fighting anti-Semitism, even if it's inconvenient. It was mentioned before me, the rising anti-Semitism on the American right. I know Trump is our best friend. It's not nice to speak about things that are inconvenient to Trump, but we must do it for the sake of Jewish diaspora, which I think is more important than any friend that we'll have in the White House. They're our family, and we need to act like they're our family. So thank you very much. These are my contact information, and feel free to reach out for if you have any questions now. If we have time, I don't know, and if not. And if you rather ask me privately, these are my contact information.